this episode of Insights interview series. As you know, we're passionate about engagement, and volunteer engagement is something that constantly comes up when we're working not only at events but with many of our not-for-profit and NGO and community organisations. And it's something I'm personally really passionate about. And we're thrilled to have Tracey O'Neill here with us, who's the Manager of Volunteer Engagement at Austin Health. Welcome, Tracey.
Thank you.
I first met Tracey many moons ago at a Volunteer in Australia Volunteer Managers Conference on the Gold Coast, and it's also where I first got introduced to an amazing volunteer engagement network called the Love Network, Leaders of Health Volunteer Engagement, and have admired the work that they've done ever since. So it's really great to catch up with Tracey and chat more about volunteer engagement. So first of all, Tracey, how did you get started in volunteer engagement?
I think it was pretty typical. I landed accidentally in volunteer engagement. I am a social worker by background, and I was working with young people at risk of suicide and self-harm. We had a really small volunteer program, about 10 volunteers, and I was a counsellor. And one of my colleagues was managing the program, and she didn't like it and wasn't coping very well, and I just got told, here you go, it's your job.
And that's something that often happens with volunteer engagement, and we'll talk a bit more about that it's just given to someone.
Absolutely.
You manage the volunteers.
Absolutely. And often as an add-on, there's no additional time, resource, money, it's just add this to the workload you already have. So, which was certainly the case, and I loved it. So I've been working with young people for some time who'd had quite traumatic experiences and was a bit burnt out. So when I left that role, I decided I actually wanted to give volunteer engagement a go. So I got my first job at the Starlight Children's Foundation.
Yeah. So you've been in your current role for over 2 years, but you've worked with Austin Health for an extra 5 years in your previous role.
Yeah, and 7.5 years now.
Yeah. What sort of volunteer roles come under your program area?
So many. So we're a really large organisation. We're one of the large 4 health services in Victoria. So we have a lot of volunteers who work directly with patients in patient support. It might be providing company on a ward or in our wellness centre at the cancer centre. We have spiritual care volunteers who support our chapel services and offer communion. We have retail volunteers who run our op shops. We also have a gift shop on site and a small bazaar at our rehabilitation hospital. We have volunteers who run activities. We have volunteer drivers. We have, who else do we have? We've had some specialised roles in the last couple of years come up supporting the prevention of delirium on wards and also supporting patients who have dementia. We have a babysitting role, supporting mums who have postnatal depression, and to allow them to access a program, we offer some on-site babysitting for them. Loads.
And it just shows the scope that volunteer roles can take. And I have an issue with the word volunteer. I haven't come up with a solution because I think it people talk about the volunteers, it generalises a group. I think it strips away the skills, the knowledge, the background that these people bring, and really just sort of grouped into one.
I think it's unfortunate because within the sector itself, I think volunteer is a really respected word. You know, volunteer means so much to us. It's when you step outside of the sector and you talk to people in our organisations or people in the corporate sector or people in government who really diminish, I think, the value of volunteers and what they contribute. Certainly I say in my organisation all the time, volunteer does not equal unskilled and unprofessional. Quite the opposite.
Or slave labour.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely.
The amount of times I work at events particularly and people come in and say, I need some volunteers. I said, well, where are these people? Like, I don't have this spare, they're not just sitting
they're
there.
Not in my back pocket.
That's right, I say that. I said, I don't have a group in my pocket that we can just, these are roles like a staff role that are recruited for, that are counted for, that are planned for. They're not just this surplus to just do dog's body kind of
and
work.
I think that we often forget, and early in my career, I think I was definitely a culprit, that you kind of assume that if people want to volunteer, they want to do anything. They'll do anything you ask them to. And I think the reality is that volunteers actually come with their own motivation, with their own goals, with things they want to achieve, with the kind of experience they want to have. And if we don't provide that experience, they're not going to stick around. And I think that that's probably, one of the skills that I think is really underestimated in our sector.
Yeah.
Really.
So there's two things I want to pick up on there. One, I remember years ago working at an event. This was about 15 years ago, 18 years ago now, and I would call them the volleys. And this, I remember the man that managed the fleet and all the drivers would say, don't use the word volley, it's really disrespectful, they're volunteers. And I used to think, that's a bit precious. Now I completely understand.
Yeah.
Because as soon as we start nicknaming or diminishing their title, which we don't do to other titles, we start diminishing their value.
That's right, yeah, absolutely. And I think I was a culprit as well. Those early days, you come in with so many assumptions about what a volunteer is, and they are very much devalued. You see them as the bottom rung in the organisation. You don't see them as partners, and I think that I called them volleys at one stage, and I think I was pulled up by a volunteer as well.
Yes,
Don't call me a volley.
Yes, and it's amazing how small things can really have an impact. I had an event years and years ago when I worked at the National Trust, and we were opening old houses, and we had amazing volunteers working there, and I bought refreshments, and I had bought cream biscuits, which I thought was nice, but I bought no-name cream biscuits, and I bought no-name milk, knowing that they were probably made by the same manufacturer. And the first thing they said, are we not good enough for brand things? And I thought, that's such a fair point, and you've got to be really careful that you don't betray them.
And they notice that, and they will tell you that.
Yes,
they will tell you. And I think that those volunteers I really respect.
Yes.
If they're prepared to stand up to me and say, "Hang on a sec, Trace.
Yeah.
You value me like I deserve."
Yes.
And I have to go. You're right. You're absolutely right. And I think,
And we would do it if we went into a staff room and the tea bags were out. We would say, we need to, So why don't we place that same respect and value on their roles?
I think for me, one of the things that I've really started to do in the last 2 years at my organisation, 2 to 3 years, is label our volunteers part of the workforce. At every moment I can, I think that making sure that the staff in our organisation are aware that they are another team, another part of the workforce who are there to help us achieve exactly the same goals. It really has helped very slowly, but it has definitely helped to kind of change the culture and perception around volunteers, the value of volunteers, and I think recognising that the responsibility for volunteers doesn't lie with the person who has volunteer in their job title, and I think that that's one of the really critical points that is often kind of lost.
Absolutely. And leading on from that, often, like yourself, the person who manages the volunteer program isn't the one they report to or that they're under the leadership of. So it's educating and working with those staff, because there's nothing worse than recruiting these great group of volunteers and then seeing them in action and treated a way that is not up to the standard that we would expect. How do you work and educate and liaise with the teams that the volunteers will end up working directly under?
So that's been a huge part of what we've done since we restructured 2.5 years ago. There was a perception prior to our restructure that our team was we were the people who were responsible for volunteers, and everyone else could kind of wash their hands. If there was a behaviour issue, if a volunteer left or God forbid, multiple volunteers, which kind of happened in those teams where volunteers weren't valued, people came back to us, and we weren't doing our job right, and we weren't recruiting enough volunteers or the right volunteers. So when we restructured and we did a number of things. The first thing we did was we created a philosophy statement around volunteering and a vision for volunteering at Austin. And so our philosophy of volunteering is that every volunteer is engaged in a role that is meaningful to them and enhances the patient experience. So there's that acknowledgement that different to a paid staff member's role, there needs to be equal balance of helping to achieve the organisation's goals and mission and supporting and valuing and honouring what the volunteer wants to get out of the experience. So that was one of the first things. Another thing we did was we renamed our team. So we were Volunteer Services, and what I said to the organisation is, well, we don't provide a service. I don't run a service. I don't have KPIs about the outcomes of services. Our role is to engage volunteers. And our volunteers actually work in over 40 teams across our organisation. 2.6 staff, we certainly can't be available for 40 teams, 50 roles and over 500 volunteers. It's impossible. They would all leave, pretty much. You get those very dedicated ones who don't. But what we decided was that we are actually responsible for how the organisation engages volunteers. We also renamed our coordinators. We don't have coordinators. We don't coordinate people. We decided that given the size of our team was unlikely to grow, however we wanted the size of our volunteer team to grow, that our staff are more like advisors or consultants to the staff. So we now have volunteer engagement advisors whose role is to advise the staff in our organisation how to best engage volunteers and have the most success out of having volunteers on their team. And the third thing that we did was develop a staff meeting for all those staff who are responsible for looking after those volunteers. So every 2 months we have a large staff meeting, and we have found, over the couple of years we've been running that, attendance and participation in that has just grown. And those who are engaging in that group are really getting, seeing the benefits of volunteers working on their teams. And so what that group does is get together and talk about the decisions that have been made about volunteering at Austin, what it's going to look like, what kind of roles we will approve, what kind of roles we won't, having input into the kind of training we have, hearing about some of the policies and procedures that, that we need to implement for volunteers, working through some change processes that we have to do. And the buy-in that we've had from those teams has been incredible, and that is reflected in the experiences our volunteers are having. And also, I think, in how much more staff are prepared to trust.
Yes.
I hate that we have to build them up to educate them to trust volunteers, but they are.
Yep.
They're starting to trust volunteers a lot more, to do a much wider range of things and have more responsibility. It's not an add-on. We're actually, our job is about embedding this incredible resource of really passionate people into the organisation to work towards a goal.
Absolutely, and it's a very proactive role.
Yes.
So many times I see organisations, their view of volunteer management, and I want to talk about the different words that we use, their view of volunteer management is we've recruited them, we've put them on a roster, and that's it. We've done our job.
Absolutely.
And it's so much more complex with the engagement before, during, after their roles to get that continual
and I think
buy-in.
that, there's often, and I remember this from my very first job, I remember we had a huge, we had our Starlight Day. I was given a target. I needed to find 750 volunteers to stand on street corners to shake tins. And we drew this massive thermometer on the wall, and I would colour it in when I got more volunteers. But I look back now and I think how awful that my value came down to how many bodies I managed to recruit. Doesn't matter if they were any good. Doesn't matter if any of them could have contributed to the organisation in another way. If they had have become volunteers in the wish granting program or the Starlight Express room, or become corporate volunteers, or done some sponsorship of another event, or there was absolutely no recognition of how integral my role could have been in that organisation. I was diminished to recruiting numbers of people, and it didn't matter who they were or what they did. And I think what I've learned over the years is, if I can do the recruitment bit really well, if I can get the right people and give them the right training and the right support, I don't need to recruit as much, because people stay, and the people you do recruit then enable you to grow your program and innovate. So I'm always saying to the senior staff at my organisation now, I don't want to recruit to replace. I don't want my job to be that we have made volunteers' experience so negative that they just keep leaving, that all I'm doing is trying to catch up and fill gaps, because it's not satisfying for anybody.
That's right. And with that retention, not only are you retaining the volunteers, excuse me, because of they're enjoying the experience and they're engaged and it's fulfilling, they tell their friends. They're your best ambassadors. They're your best referral funnels, for want of a better word. And people don't value that either.
They don't. And not just for future volunteers as well. You know, one of the things that I would really like to do is build a better relationship with our fundraising team. You know, because I think that people who volunteer don't necessarily just tell potential volunteers, they tell potential supporters, potential future paid employees, potential donors. You know, if our volunteers, if we can, you know, engage them in a way that they want to become really passionate ambassadors, other people are going to want to be involved in our organisation in whatever way they can.
Yeah, and your point about recruiting right is so important. It's not just bodies, and often I work with organisations and do training, and they say our key thing is how to deal with difficult volunteers. And my answer is at the recruitment stage.
That's right.
Because if you don't recruit the right person for the right role, and it might not be that they're, you know, not the right fit for the organisation might not be the right fit for them. Or have you actually explained the role properly? Have you set this expectation? And then they've come into the role and it's actually this. Well, of course there's going to be discontent and you're going to have issues.
Right.
So recruitment is so important around your messaging, but also interviewing volunteers. And even if it's a, you know, if it's a one-time event and, you know, they might be working 1 8-hour shift, have a chat to them on the phone, understand, because...
And set expectations. So I think I've got two things to say about that one. The first is around the messaging, as you say, and it comes even before you're speaking to people at the interview stage. You know, the number of times, and it still happens in my organisation, and I tear them down, that I see signs up saying we're desperate for volunteers, and I'm like, if you tell people you're desperate for volunteers, you're going to get desperate volunteers. They're not going to care about what they get out of it. They're not going to care about your organisation. They're not necessarily going to be reliable. They're not going to want to attend the training. They're just like, oh, you know, this sounds like a good idea, or oh, Centrelink told me I have to, or oh, mum's on my back and I have to do something, oh, I'll just do it. You're not going to get any benefit out of those people. You need to be sending the right message about how people can contribute to your mission and your goals of the organisation. And that needs to matter.
That sign just reminded me, I worked with an organisation where they did a big review and a big survey to their members, and their volunteers were mainly members. So we could ask questions about, do you volunteer, what got you in, what kept you in, or if you're not volunteering, what stopped you? And the common thing was we're treated like slave labour, that we're not thanked, and that when it comes to a working bee or an event, there's this quick scramble of we need you. That, I mean, we know how that would make us feel. So these are people.
Well, and I think that kind of leads on to my second point, is that, you know, we do often get dropped in these roles to start with, and while we're often great people, and that's why we're recommended for the role, because we work really well with people. There's been no consideration to the kind of skills that you need to work with volunteers. One of them is around interviewing. It is around being able to have that really difficult conversation with someone who's not the right fit. It's about being able to set expectations about behaviour. It's about them being able to pull people in and have that conversation when they're not meeting your expectations. And I think being able to speak to your organisation as well and really kind of set some boundaries. And that's tough, saying, you know, we've done that now. I now no longer allow, we don't approve administration roles in our organisation unless there's a direct patient benefit. Now, historically, it's, oh, okay, you want to admin, I'll go and get an admin volunteer, because we've always got people who want to do admin. You know, but they are, you know, I have one volunteer who came to the organisation who wanted to work with patients, and she started working with patients, and, you know, staff started asking her to do some other things, and she was really happy to help. And by the time we'd had our restructure and we'd started talking to her, she was stuck in a back office with nobody doing the archiving, because no one could be bothered doing it, you know. She's like, this is not why I came here. I'm like, of course it's not why you came here. So I think that there's a lot of skills that are really are not considered by an organisation, or even sometimes by, you know, a manager, in terms of what we need to be able to do to really run an effective volunteer engagement program.
And it's so important to do that pushback to the staff that are coming to you saying, I need volunteers,
Yes.
and pushing back and going, you know, really drilling down, is there really a need?
Yes.
Is this role appropriate for a volunteer?
Yes.
How is it going to be supported with training, with structure, with leadership? And the other thing is understanding that every volunteer role is different. So it's not recruiting this pool of volunteers and then, well, they can go and do that and we need 10 over here and we need 12 there.
So, and the way I like to describe it is the traditional volunteer paradigm is, you know, you have role A, role B and role C, and you can do role A because you have admin skills, and you can do role B because you are available on a Tuesday and we need someone on a Tuesday. And we don't think about the right match. When we think about the right match and we place people in the roles that they're really passionate about and are going to have great outcomes for the organisation, they don't want to go and do things that you're asking them to do at a drop of a hat. I don't want to go stuff some envelopes because talking to that person over there is actually why I come here, and it's what makes me fulfilled. And I think that teaching staff, you know, educating staff about that, to say, that's not what I do. I don't recruit people to be available at a moment's notice. And it's a tough conversation to have, particularly when you're new to the role or new to an organisation. And that has been the perception of volunteers in that organisation. It is tough.
And often the volunteer group can be your biggest stakeholder. And that's what I often work with organisations to educate it. And I say, you wouldn't treat a sponsor like this. You wouldn't treat that stakeholder like this. So don't treat volunteers like this.
Well, and I think probably in my organisation as well. So a lot of our volunteers are consumers, what we call them in health. So they are patients, or their families have been patients. But in a lot of, you know, charities and not-for-profits, your volunteers are your service users. They're people who are so grateful for what you've given them that they want to give back, you know, and they are your stakeholders.
Yes.
And you want to be, you know, engaging them and building that relationship and that partnership with them.
Absolutely.
You know, you can't just dismiss them.
That's right. And we've talked about the lack of respect, and what I often see is a lack of respect for the role that we're putting the volunteers in. And if you don't respect the role or don't understand why someone would want to take on that role, that's going to filter down. And I remember I worked with the Melbourne International 3-day event, which is a horse event that historically had been filled with volunteers from the horse sector. So equestrian riders, family, and we needed to grow the volunteers by about another 100 volunteers. And when I came on, everyone said, well, you're not going to fill, you know, why would anyone else want to volunteer here? And I was like, are you kidding? This is an international event. And we knew that people who were from the equestrian sector wanted to volunteer on particular roles, where you're on a jump or where you're near a horse, or because that's their passion. Yet all these people that we went to outside of the market loved doing the roles that the equestrian people didn't like. But they loved doing them because they got to mix with people, they were part of a big event, they may have had a fear of a horse, they didn't want to be near a horse. So it was really identifying.
Absolutely.
And I remember after the first one where we had this whole group of new people come in, but we were all one team, that people who'd been working there for years said, people loved it. You know, they're saying to us, they didn't even see a horse, but they had an amazing day. And it's like, yes. Yeah. But it's really understanding the value to different people about what your organisation or what your event
and it goes back to what you said before about, you know, the time it can take and touching base with people, interviewing, even having a conversation with an event. And I think as a sector, and look, this probably comes from the fact that we are really under-resourced. We're often not paid enough. We don't have enough staff to manage the size of the teams. You know, when I started in my current organisation, my director had 25 reports, and they changed his role because that was too many and he had 5. I'm like, oh, still got 500 over here. You know, and I think that, you know, that is what it is at the moment, and we're working to change that. But I think that you've got to invest in the right things as a leader of volunteers, and it's time consuming and it's hard work. But when you invest in the right things, like interviewing people or making sure you're developing a role properly, in having, you know, one of the things that we push back in our organisation is our volunteers used to do a 3-hour induction. And I said, well, I want a 4-day induction. And my boss is like, oh, no, you can't ask volunteers to do that. I'm like, well, yeah, I can. And I think, we haven't. We've gone to 2 days to start with, but we're already seeing that that's likely going to have to grow to 3 days. But we know, my previous program at the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Wellness and Research Institute, the initial training there is 10 weeks long. And when people finish that training, they say, oh my God, I feel so confident to step into my role. I feel so valued because I've met so many different staff members from around the organisation. You've taken me on tours. I know how I might respond. We've practiced what to do in really difficult situations. And that program is one of the programs with the highest retention rates because those volunteers feel, supported and prepared and connected to the team.
And they feel valued because they've been invested in.
Absolutely.
Yes. Exactly. And I think people underestimate or dismiss it. And I used to have comments made to me like, volunteers don't want paperwork. And we would do our surveys and they wanted position descriptions. They wanted structure so that they felt a safety in their role, that they understood what their expectations were. They had a clear expectation of what the organisation would offer them and that they were protected in a way that their role was a proper role. It's not just this ad hoc, loose kind of,
whatever anyone else can't be bothered doing and they'll just ask me on the day.
Yeah.
That's right. And I, again, I think it goes back to what we value and what our outcomes are. Don't leave volunteers out of policies and procedures. Invite them to events. Say thank you. Include them when you say, our organisation used to say we have 8,500 staff. I'm like, what about my team?
Yes.
Whereas now they do say we have 9,000 staff and 5 volunteers as part of our workforce. And that's been a huge change for our team.
And it's so, what you touched on there is about that lack of respect, that lack of value. And that starts with how the organisation values and respects the volunteer department.
Oh, yes.
The volunteer program. And constantly I see, and we touched on that earlier about great people being put in that role, but that aren't trained, that aren't skilled. And I often say you wouldn't get an unskilled person to run this program, or you wouldn't get an unskilled person to manage that. So why do we think we can do it with volunteer managers?
That's right.
And leading on from that, I see that gap, and we've talked about it before, in the lack of training.
That's right.
And professional development that's either offered or organisations allow their volunteer managers to go on. And I remember when we were at, I think it was at the Canberra Volunteer in Australia conference, and I think they didn't have the number of delegates that wanted. And we were sitting there going, okay, we know there's this many 100,000 not-for-profits in Australia who would all have volunteer managers, and there's 400 people at this conference.
Yeah, we've lost some amazing people in our sector. We really have, and we've lost them not because of the sector, but often because they haven't been valued and they haven't been able to upskill, and they haven't been able to have the kind of impact that they really believed that they could working with volunteers. And I think that's a real shame. I think you're absolutely right. If we are going to I don't have an issue at all. I think with bringing unskilled people into our sector, one of the beautiful things about volunteer engagement is you don't have to have a qualification to get in the sector. And I think that while there's a requirement for training and there's an ongoing conversation about, certification and qualifications and, how do we prove that we have a thorough, ethical kind of body of professional knowledge, we come from thousands of different sectors, and I think that's what makes us so rich in experience and knowledge, and I think that it's important for organisations to understand that this is a really critical role in terms of supporting the professional development of leaders, of volunteers. And there is, there's a fair bit out there. We're probably lacking for some of those more advanced leaders, but certainly there is so much training out there for people who are new to the sector. There's mentoring programs, there's webinars, there's podcasts now, there's an online journal, there's so much stuff, but I know for myself, can I pay $70 for this? No, we don't have the budget. It's the same as can I have some name brand biscuits, please?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
You can have the stale ones from the back of the cupboard we haven't used. So, you're right.
We talked about, touched on the Volunteering Australia Management Conferences a bit, and you're talking at the one in Perth in late March.
I am.
Tell me what you're talking on and why you're passionate to share that knowledge with the sector.
So I've got to remember, my talk is called Making a Ruckus, Volunteer Managers Agitating for Change.
Yep.
And really it's about the kind of skills I believe that we need to develop as leaders in volunteer engagement to really elevate the profession, both I guess out there in the community and in the professional world, but within our organisations as well, to really demonstrate the impact that volunteers can have. Because I think that's what is really lacking. I think if people, we take the bushfires for example.
Yep.
It takes a disaster like this for people to realise the impact of volunteers, and to be completely honest, the impact is probably, visible because there are tens of thousands of them.
Yep.
If there weren't tens of thousands of them, they will probably be forgotten in the bushfires as well. It only took a volume. So, whereas for me, God, one volunteer bushfire saving a house or saving a life is incredible.
Yeah.
So I think there's a set of skills that we really need as leaders of volunteers to really enhance I guess how people value us and how people see us as a profession. And
I'll just touch on that. Managers of volunteer programs aren't volunteers.
No.
That's the other big misconception, which I think devalues it constantly as well.
Well, for formal volunteer programs, there's certainly a lot of volunteers who do manage volunteers.
Yes.
We've got an amazing local charity here, Big Group Hug, that's run by a volunteer, and she manages 190, nearly 200 volunteers, which is incredible.
And I remember also at that conference, one session that sticks out in my mind was how to engage young people in volunteering. And the panel were all over 40.
They were.
Nothing wrong with being over 40, but they're all over 40. Right. And once again, it was about bodies. How do we just get young bodies into roles? And I remember once again, all you needed to do was hop on Twitter. People saying, perhaps they should ask young people how they want to volunteer.
And said, how about having a young person on your panel?
Or actually understanding what kind of volunteering younger people are wanting to do. Not just filling your traditional roles and sort of potentially outdated models.
So I think this is probably something really important to talk about. We're moving out of the traditional paradigm of volunteering. Our organisations don't know that. They're kind of not cluey enough yet to know that. A lot of our leaders of volunteers don't even know that. But contemporary volunteers do not want to volunteer in the traditional way. And this is another one of those really challenging conversations that we have to be prepared to have. So at my organisation, I'm really pushing back on people, take our op shops for example. Yes. Oh, we need people, all of our volunteers are getting older and the shop's going to have to shut, and but they need to come in for a whole day, and they need to come in every week, and because they're new they need to go out the back and do the sorting. And I say, well, unfortunately that's not what young people want anymore. Yep. They want flexibility. They want to learn leadership skills. Yep. If they want to get into retail, they're probably going to want to work on the checkout. They want to be able to maybe come in on a Tuesday here and then a Thursday then, because they've got tutorials and they're out with friends, and
and they might not stay 20 years.
That's
okay.
And that's okay.
You might have them for a year, but that's okay if you start building your model around that.
That's exactly right. And I think that I guess the biggest point that I'd like to make about this is it's our job. It's not the volunteers' job to adapt.
Yes.
It is not their job to say, oh, okay, I'll do whatever it is you want me to do. They're not going to stay. We are wasting our own time and setting ourselves up to fail if we keep creating traditional roles, if we don't allow flexibility, if we don't allow micro-volunteering. We know at the moment that young people are no longer getting exposed to volunteering because we've put so much red tape in place. Families can't introduce their kids to volunteering, and so when young people are getting into high school and university, it's often not even on their radar because it's not been a value that has been instilled in them from their family. So we don't provide opportunities for families to volunteer. We don't provide opportunities for kids to come in and see volunteering and what it means. we don't offer the opportunity for people to go away for 6 months or 12 months and come back without having to go through an entire induction process again, you know. And we work in a really risk-averse sector, and part of that is because our organisations don't understand what we do and don't understand volunteers, and therefore they want to control it and reduce it as much as possible so that they think they're reducing the risk. And again, I say volunteer doesn't equal risk.
Yes.
Because you can put risk mitigation in for volunteers, and often having volunteers involved in a program is reducing other types of risk as well, you know.
Thank you so much. We've covered a lot. It's been so great to chat to you. I'm so excited to hear more about when, you know, the conference is in action, and see how your presentation goes, and the amazing stuff that you're continuing to do, and really champion and as an advocate for not only volunteers but for volunteer managers as well. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode.